I'm Sloan Hargrove, 49 years old, and I started at 19, shaking at a console in a cold, dark room, holding up one small piece of the sky. For 30 years, I gave that work everything I had, every long shift, every hard track, every seat on the floor, because I believed the chair was sacred. But when a colonel who did not know my name pulled me out of that chair in front of his entire command and told me to let the adults handle it, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who had no idea who you really were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. I have loved cold rooms full of screens since I was 19 years old. Most people will never stand in one. They drive past the fence line and see antennas and a low gray building and think nothing of it, and that is exactly how it is supposed to work. A handful of us spend our whole lives inside those buildings, in the dark, holding up one piece of the sky so that everyone outside can forget the sky is something that has to be held. The morning this story happened, I rode onto the installation before the sun was up in the back of a plain sedan, wearing a plain duty uniform with nothing on it that would make a busy soldier look twice. My aide sat beside me with a thick binder balanced on her knees. Major Talia Reyes was 34 years old, sharp as a new blade, and she had learned in 11 months of working for me that I did not like to talk much before I had seen a floor with my own eyes. "You could just announce yourself, ma'am," she said, watching the guard shack come up in the headlights. "Save everyone the trouble." "If I announce myself, I see the floor they want me to see," I told her. "I would rather see the real one." That was the whole reason I had come myself instead of sending a team. In 9 days, I would take command of the Air and Missile Defense Organization for the entire region. Every operations floor, like the one I was about to walk into, would be mine to answer for. You cannot inspect a floor from a briefing slide. You cannot feel from a slide whether a crew is calm. You have to sit down at the edge of the room and let it forget you are there. I want to take you back for just a minute to the first time I ever sat at one of those consoles, because you cannot understand why the rest of this matters if you do not understand what the chair means to me. It was 1996. I was 19, fresh out of training, a brand new operator on a Patriot crew, and I was terrified. The screen in front of me was a mess of symbols I only half understood, and somewhere out in the dark there were aircraft, and it was my job to tell the difference between the ones that were supposed to be there and the ones that were not. My hands were shaking so badly I sat on one of them. The senior sergeant on that crew was a man named Delbert Cruz. He was a command sergeant major by the end of his career, and he became the closest thing to a second father I ever had. But that night he was just the scariest voice in a dark room. He crouched down next to my chair, and I braced for him to tell me I did not belong there. Instead, he pointed at the screen and said, very quietly, "That thing does not care about your rank. It does not care about your last name or your father's name, or whether you cried in the bathroom before your shift. It cares about one thing. It cares whether you are right. So be right." I have built an entire career on that one sentence. Be right. Not be loud. Not be senior. Not be liked. Be right at the console. Where the truth sits still long enough to look at. I learned exactly what it costs to be wrong later on, in a place I do not describe at dinner parties on a night when the tracks on my screen were not simulated. I was a lieutenant then, a tactical director on a battery a long way from home, and the air picture in front of me stopped being a training problem and became a set of decisions with weight. I will not tell you the details, because they are not mine to tell, and because they belong to people who are not here to tell theirs. I will only tell you that on that night I understood, in my body and not just in my head, what Cruz had meant. The screen did not care that I was young or tired or frightened, or that my hands wanted to shake the way they had at 19. It cared whether I was right. People I never met went home to their families because a handful of us in a cold room were right when it counted, and I have carried that ever since. Quietly, the way you carry the important things. So I do not treat a console as a piece of furniture. I do not treat a crew as a line on a readiness slide. When I walk onto a floor, I am walking into the room where the difference between right and wrong is not an abstraction. It is people, somewhere, who will or will not go home. That is what the chair means to me. And it is why what happened on that floor mattered to me far more than a bruised piece of pride ever could. For 30 years I climbed. I commissioned. I commanded a battery. I ran a battalion operations shop. I commanded a battalion of my own, then a brigade. I did tours where the tracks on the screen were not simulated, where being wrong meant something I still do not talk about at dinner. And through all of it, the thing that steadied me was never the rank on my chest. It was the memory of the chair, and the man crouched beside it, telling me to be right. So when the sedan stopped outside a low gray building at 0500 that morning, and Reyes handed me the binder, and I stood in the cold with my breath showing, I was not thinking like a general about to inspect a subordinate. I was thinking like a 19-year-old about to walk back into the only room where she had ever felt completely herself. I paused at the door, the way I have paused at that door for 3 decades. Then I stepped into the dark. The operations hall opened up in front of me exactly the way they always do. A long, dim room banked with screens, each one throwing a little cold light onto the face of the soldier in front of it. The air was chilled to keep the equipment happy. There was that low electronic hum you stop hearing after your first year and never fully hear again. I stood at the back, in the shadow between 2 racks of equipment, and I did the thing I know how to do better than almost anything else in the world. I read the room. The first thing I read was that the room was being performed, not run. There's a way a good floor sounds. It is quiet. The best floor supervisors are almost invisible. They move behind the crews, they murmur, they touch a shoulder, they ask a question instead of giving a speech, and the fight happens on the screens where it belongs. I have known supervisors so good you could not have picked them out of the room if your life depended on it. Which was the point, because on the worst night of their lives, their job was to be the calm that let 9 other people work. This floor did not sound like that. This floor had a voice, and the voice belonged to a colonel. His name, I would learn, was Pierce Dunmore, and he was the battalion commander, which meant this evaluation was his to pass or fail. He was a big man with a good haircut and a carrying voice, and he was working the room like a host at a party. There were 3 inspectors visiting from a higher headquarters standing near the supervisor's station, and Dunmore had arranged himself so that every good thing that happened on the floor seemed to happen near him and because of him. He narrated. He explained his own crews to the visitors while the crews were still working. He laughed at the right moments. He was, in the most literal sense, putting on a show, and the show was about Colonel Dunmore. I had seen it 100 times, and it always meant the same thing. A floor that performs for the visitors is a floor that has stopped working for the mission. I did not write anything down yet. I just filed it and kept reading. The second thing I read was the deputy. Lieutenant Colonel Grady Voss shadowed Dunmore half a step behind, a lean, watchful man who had clearly learned that the safest place in that battalion was directly in the colonel's wake. A track came up on one of the crews that got mishandled, a junior operator hesitating on a classification, and instead of fixing it, Voss leaned in and said something to the crew that I recognized instantly as a slogan. Trust your training, stay ahead of it. It sounded like leadership. It fixed nothing. The operator was not behind because of a lack of confidence. He was behind because no one had taught him the specific procedure he needed in that specific moment, and a slogan does not teach procedure. I filed that too. And then I read the third thing, which was the reason I stopped filing and started paying attention with my whole body. At the far end of the room, at one of the quietest consoles, there was a young soldier doing the actual work. There is always one. On every floor, in every hard job, at the quietest station in the room, there is one person doing the real thing, while everyone louder takes the credit. On this floor, it was a specialist, and his name tape said Bello. He was young, maybe 24, and he had the particular stillness of someone concentrating so hard that the noise of the room had ceased to reach him. A track had developed on his scope, low and slow and ambiguous. The kind of contact that does not announce what it is, that could be nothing or could be the whole reason the room exists. The easy thing, the thing the tempo of the exercise wanted, was to dismiss it. Slow and low and near the edge, call it clutter, move on, keep the scenario flowing for the visitors. Bello did not dismiss it. He worked it, calmly, methodically, running the checks in the right order, refusing to be rushed, holding a hand near his controls and his eyes on the contact while the exercise tried to pull the room past him. Nobody thanked him. Nobody even noticed. And that told me more about the floor than anything the colonel had said all morning. I watched the room around Bello while he worked, and I read the rest of the tells, the way you read a page you have read 1,000 times before. There was the way the crews looked toward the supervisor's station before they committed to a call, checking not the picture, but the colonel, waiting for a nod that told them it was safe to be sure. There was the way the good calls got narrated loudly and the near misses got smoothed over quietly, so that the visitors only ever heard the parts that made the battalion look sharp. There was the tempo, which was a little too fast, pushed along not by the threat, but by the desire to keep the demonstration moving, to keep it impressive, to never let a hard track sit long enough to make the floor look uncertain in front of the inspection team. Every one of those things is a small thing. Any one of them, on its own, means nothing. But I have spent 30 years in these rooms, and I know what it means when you see all of them at once. It means the floor has quietly reorganized itself around making one man look good, and the mission has become the backdrop instead of the point. The thing about a floor like that is that it works fine, right up until the moment it does not. It passes evaluations, as it looks disciplined. The crews are competent, and the equipment is maintained, and the slides are green. And then one night, a hard track develops, a real one, and the loudest, most senior, most confident person in the room is certain about the wrong thing. And everyone has been trained by 1,000 small moments to check his face and wait for his nod. And nobody says, stop. That is the failure mode. It does not show up in a demonstration. It shows up once, on the worst night, and by then it is too late to fix. My whole job, standing in that shadow, was to see it before that night came. Bello did not check anyone's face. That was what set him apart. He kept his eyes on the scope and his hand near his controls, and he worked the track on its own terms, and he did not look toward the colonel even once to see whether he was allowed to be right. It was the single most encouraging thing I saw all morning, and it was about to make him the only person in the room who tried to speak up when it mattered. I watched Bello for a long time from the shadows. I watched him catch the track and hold it and slowly resolve it into something the crew could act on. Entirely on his own, without help, without praise, without so much as a nod. And I felt the thing I always feel when I see quiet competence go unremarked in a loud room. I felt like I was 19 again, and I wanted to crouch down next to that chair and tell him he was right. Colonel Dunmore came by Bellows Station once near the end of that track. He glanced at the resolved contact, understood in half a second that a good call had been made, and turned to the visiting inspectors with it already in his mouth as his own. "This is the kind of discipline we build here," he said, gesturing at the screen, at the work Bello had done. "We stay calm, we stay ahead of the picture." He did not look at Bello. He did not learn the specialist's name. He took the one genuinely good thing on his floor, wore it for the visitors like a borrowed jacket, and walked away. I saw Bello's face when the colonel's back was turned. It was not anger. It was something quieter and worse than anger. It was the face of a young person learning, one more time, that being right in a room full of loud people does not get you anything, that the reward for keeping your hand on the hard track is that a colonel takes the credit and does not learn your name. I made a decision then that I want you to understand clearly, because everything that happened next came out of it. I decided to sit down next to him, not to inspect him, not to test him. I had already seen everything I needed to see about Specialist Bello. I sat down because I wanted to watch the next hard track from the inside, from the chair, the way I had learned it, and because some part of me, the 19-year-old part that never fully leaves people like us, simply wanted to be an operator at a screen again for a few minutes before I became a general who answered for all of them. There was an empty chair at the console beside his. I crossed the floor quietly, in my plain uniform, with nothing on it worth a second look, and I pulled the chair up next to Specialist Bello, and I sat down at the edge of a room I was 9 days from commanding. I did not know it yet, but I was about to be thrown out of it. For a few minutes it was perfect. I leaned in close and asked Bello, under my breath, to talk me through his picture, and he did, quietly, the way you do when a stranger who clearly knows the equipment sits down beside you and asks a real question, He did not know who I was. He assumed I was one of the inspectors, or an observer from somewhere, and he was too focused to care. He walked me through his scope in a low voice, and a new track began to develop. A genuinely hard one, and for a little while there were just two operators in the dark, working a problem together. It was the happiest I had been all week. I want you to know that, because of what came next. There, Bello murmured, tipping his chin at a contact. That one. It is doing the thing again. Slow, staying low, hugging the edge. Everybody wants to call it clutter. What do you think it is? I asked. I think it is exactly what it wants me to think it is not, he said, and I almost smiled, because that was the right instinct, the one you cannot teach, the one Cruz had spent a year drilling into me. I opened my mouth to tell him so. I did not get the chance, because that was the moment Colonel Dunmore turned around and saw a woman he did not recognize sitting at a live fire control console on his floor. He crossed the room fast. I heard him before I saw him, that carrying voice cutting across the hum, and then he was standing over the two of us, and he did not look at my collar, and he did not look at my face long enough to learn anything from it. He looked at an unfamiliar woman in a chair that, in his mind, she had no business occupying, in front of the visitors he was performing for, and he did the thing that men like Colonel Dunmore do when their show is interrupted. He reasserted control in the loudest, simplest way available to him. "Let the adults handle this," he said, and he took the back of my chair and pulled it away from the console by the armrest, hard enough that the wheels barked against the floor. The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The particular silence of 9 people who have just watched something happen that they do not have a script for. Bello's head came up. The visitors near the supervisor's station stopped talking. Somewhere a piece of equipment beeped and no one moved to answer it. Dunmore pointed at the door. "Observers wait outside," he said. "This is a live evaluation, not a field trip." Bello found his voice first. "Sir, wait, she was helping me work the—" "I did not ask you, specialist." Dunmore did not even turn his head to say it. He kept his eyes on me, arms folding, waiting for me to get up and leave, certain that I would, because in his experience, the woman in the plain uniform always did. I sat there for one more second, and I looked at him, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I had been thrown out of better rooms than this one. In 30 years, I had been underestimated in more ways than I could count, in more countries than I could count. But I had never been thrown out of a room I already owned. I looked once at Bello, who was staring at me with something like apology on his face, as if he had gotten me in trouble. I looked once at the frozen track glowing on his scope, the slow, low contact still hugging the edge, unresolved, abandoned the instant a colonel raised his voice. And then I stood up. I didn't reach for anything. No badge, no name, no rank. I simply stood, and I turned, and I walked the 4 steps to the current operations microphone at the supervisor's station, while a colonel who did not know my name stood beside an empty chair with his arms folded, waiting for me to see myself out. I did not announce my rank. I want you to understand that, because people always assume that is how it went, that I spun around and showed him my star and enjoyed the look on his face. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter, and in the end it was much heavier. I reached the supervisor's station, and I picked up the current operations microphone, the one that pipes to every position on the floor, and I keyed it, and I said 6 words in the same flat, unhurried voice I would use to order coffee. "Cease play. This crew is decertified." The words landed on the floor like a dropped tray. The exercise controllers at the back straightened. The word decertified is not a small word in that building. It is not an insult, and it is not a threat. It is a finding, and a finding can only be made by one kind of authority. And everyone in that room who understood the equipment understood, in the space of a breath, that the authority had just been exercised over the correct microphone by someone who knew exactly which button to press. Then I gave the order that emptied the room. "All non-essential personnel off the floor," I said. "Now." And here's the thing about a correct order given over the right microphone in the right voice. People obey it before they have decided who you are. The controllers moved first, the visitors moved. Junior soldiers who were not on a certified position began to file toward the door because the instruction was correct. It came from the supervisor's station, and 30 years of training told them that when the current operations microphone says off the floor, you get off the floor and you sort out the why in the hallway. Colonel Dunmore did not move because Colonel Dunmore still did not understand. "Who authorized?" he started, his voice climbing, and I turned around and looked at him, and I told him who I was, not as a weapon. For the record, because procedure required that the person halting a live evaluation identify herself, and because the room deserved to know whose order it was following out the door. "Brigadier General Hargrove," I said, "I take command of this organization in 9 days. I have been standing on your floor for 40 minutes. I watched the rest of the color leave his face. It did not give me the satisfaction people imagine. There is no pleasure in watching a man understand, all at once, the size of the mistake he cannot take back. He had not made a joke that fell flat. He had physically pulled a woman out of a chair and pointed her at the door in front of his entire command and 3 inspectors, and the woman was 9 days from being his commander's commander. He knew it now. I could see him doing the arithmetic, and I could see him arriving at the answer, and the answer took the last of the color with it. The room finished emptying in silence. It took perhaps 30 seconds. When it was done, the long, dark hall held 4 people. Me, Major Reyes, who had come in at the back and now stood very still with the binder against her chest, Colonel Dunmore, and the frozen air picture glowing on 9 abandoned screens, the slow, low track still hugging the edge of Specialist Bellow's scope, unresolved, exactly where it had been when a hand came off it. I did not clear that room to embarrass him. I need you to believe that, because it is the whole point of the story. I cleared it because of what the room had told me in the 10 seconds after he pulled my chair. A crew that will take a hand off a live track the instant a senior man raises his voice is not a safe crew. It does not matter how sharp the individual operators are. It does not matter that the specialist at the quiet console was the best I had seen in a year. And if the culture of the floor is that the loudest rank in the room wins, then the loudest rank in the room can be wrong at the worst possible moment and no one will say stop. And in 9 days, that was going to be my floor, and my responsibility, and my name on the line when it mattered. I stayed behind with Reyes, and, once they were summoned, the exercise controllers, to freeze the evaluation data before anyone could tidy it. I was methodical about it. I was not angry, or if I was angry, it was the cold kind that makes you more precise, not less. We captured the state of every position at the moment I called cease play, including the abandoned track, including the timestamps, including the 30 seconds of silence. Reyes waited until the controllers had stepped away before she spoke, quietly, the way she did when she was checking on me and not the mission. "Are you all right, ma'am?" I thought about it honestly because she deserved an honest answer. "The insult I could forget by lunch," I said. "Being called an observer, being pulled out of the chair, that is nothing. I have been called worse by better." "But," she said. "But 9 soldiers watched a hand come off a live track," I said, and not one of them said stop. That was the part that stung, and it was not about me at all. Dunmore had done a rude and stupid thing, and Dunmore would answer for it. But Dunmore was almost beside the point. The finding was not one bad colonel. The finding was a room full of good, trained, capable soldiers who had learned, somewhere, from someone, that when a loud senior man makes a mistake, your job is to go quiet and let it happen. That is not a discipline problem in a single specialist. That is a culture, and cultures are taught, and I already had a good idea who had been doing the teaching. I looked down the dark hall at the 9 glowing screens and the 1 abandoned track, and I felt the weight of the next 9 days settle onto my shoulders, heavier than any change of command ceremony could have made it. By that afternoon, I had done the thing I should always do, and did not always want to do, which was to take it up the chain the correct way, instead of settling it myself on the floor. I called Lieutenant General Warren Petrie, the commander who had dispatched me, and I reported it straight, including my own part in provoking it. I have never believed in a finding that leaves out the finder's fingerprints. I sat down at a console next to a young operator to watch a hard track, I told him. The battalion commander did not recognize me, called me an observer, and physically removed me from the chair in front of his floor and the inspection team. There was a pause on the line, and then Petrie, who has known me for 20 years, made a sound that was almost a laugh, but was mostly a sigh. "You went and sat at a console again. It is the only place the truth ever sits still, sir. What is the actual finding, Sloan? Not the story. The finding. The finding is that the crew stayed silent when a hand came off a live track," I said. "The colonel is a symptom. The silence is the problem. I am decertifying the crew, and I am recommending he be relieved from the watch pending the outcome. And I am going to change the standard so this cannot happen again on any floor in the command. You take command in 9 days, Petrie said. You could let this one slide and inherit a clean slate. Most people would. It would be the smooth thing to do. I could, I agreed. But I was the specialist in that chair once, sir. I remember what it felt like to be the one nobody would listen to. I am not going to spend 9 days pretending I did not see it. There was another pause, and then he said the thing that let me do my job. It is your finding. I will back it. Write it clean. Dunmore asked to see me before I left the building. I agreed because a person is owed the chance to speak, and because I wanted to understand how a competent officer had ended up running his floor like a stage. He came in with charm first, which is how men like that always start. He was rueful, self-deprecating, a good-humored professional acknowledging an honest mistake between colleagues. Well, he said with a small laugh, you certainly made your point, General. I will be telling that story on myself for years. He spread his hands. Let us not turn one bad minute into a career, though. No one was hurt. The track got resolved. It was 30 seconds. It was not 1 minute, I said. And it was not the 30 seconds you pulled my chair. It was the 30 seconds after, when your entire floor stayed silent and a live track sat abandoned, because you had taught them that the loudest man in the room is always right. The charm went out of him then, and what came next was his record. He listed it. The commands, the deployments, the evaluations passed, the reputation built over 24 years, all of it offered up not as a defense of what happened, but as a reason it should not count. I let him finish because there is a cruelty in interrupting a man who is trying to save himself, but I did not change my face and I did not change my mind. When he was done, I told him, without heat, that his record was real and that it did not buy back the silence on his floor, and that I would be writing the finding myself. He tried one more time, from a different direction, and I will give him this much. It was the most honest thing he said in the whole conversation. You do not understand the pressure of running that floor with an inspection team standing over your shoulder, he said. You want it to look sharp. You want them to see a battalion that has it together. So maybe I push the tempo. Maybe I run it a little hot for the audience. That is not a crime, General. No, I agreed. It is not a crime. It is the whole problem. You ran your floor for the audience instead of for the mission, and you did it so consistently that your crews learned to do the same. They stopped working the sky and started working you. That is not one bad minute. That is 100 small mornings, and I watched the last one. The audience you were performing for is the reason a hand came off a live track when you raised your voice. You did not break a rule, Colonel. You built a room where breaking the most important rule felt like good manners. He had no answer for that because there was not one, and we both knew it, and I stood up and left him with it. Before I left, Lieutenant Colonel Voss found a moment to catch me in the corridor, and in 90 seconds he told me everything I needed to know about how the floor had come to be the way it was. He did not defend Dunmore. He distanced himself from him. He was careful and smooth, and eager to make sure I understood that he personally had always had reservations, that he was really more of a steadying influence, that the colonel could be difficult. It was a masterclass in surviving, and it was exactly the instinct that had taught 9 soldiers to go quiet. Dunmore had pulled the chair, but 9 people had let him, and a deputy who echoed the loudest man in every room had taught them how. I stood in that corridor, in the same building where I had been pulled out of a chair 3 hours earlier, and I understood that my first act as the incoming commander was not going to be about one colonel at all. It was going to be about a habit. I borrowed an empty desk and I sat down, and I began to write the finding in my own hand. The inspection ran its course over the next several days, and the consequences landed, and they stuck. I want to be careful about how I tell you this part, because it would be easy to make it a revenge scene, and it was not one. It was the institution doing what the institution is supposed to do, slowly and on the record, without anyone raising a voice. The battalion failed the certification. Not on a technicality, and not because a specialist had once been sitting in the wrong chair. It failed on the specific ground I had written into the finding, which was that the crew had demonstrated it would not protect the integrity of a live track under command pressure. That is the one thing an air defense crew cannot be allowed to fail, because the entire purpose of the crew is to be right about the sky even when someone senior and certain and loud wants them to be quiet. A crew that goes silent when a colonel raises his voice is a crew that will go silent on the night it matters, and there are no do-overs on the night it matters. Colonel Dunmore was relieved from the watch. In time, the path to his next command closed, the way those paths close in our world, without drama, in a series of quiet conversations and unwritten decisions. He had built 24 years, and most of them were good, and none of that was undone. But the thing he had wanted next did not come, and everyone understood why, and no one had to say it out loud. I did not gloat over it. I did not attend to it at all, really. It happened above me and around me the way weather happens, and my attention was somewhere else entirely. My attention was on the deputy and on the 9. I had Lieutenant Colonel Voss reassigned off the operations floor. I did not end his career. I could have, and there were people who thought I should have, and there is a version of me from earlier in my life who would have wanted to. But ruining Voss would have been about me, about the corridor and the smooth 90 seconds and the survivor's instinct that had rubbed me the wrong way. The mission did not need Voss ruined. The mission needed Voss nowhere near a floor, because the specific harm he did was to a floor, where he had spent years teaching crews that echoing the loudest man was the same thing as being right. So I moved him to a job where he could do good work and could not teach that lesson to anyone else, and I let the rest of his record stand. The harder work was the 9, because the 9 had not done anything you could put in a finding. They had not been rude, they had not broken a rule. They had simply gone quiet at exactly the moment their whole purpose demanded that one of them say stop, and you cannot relieve a soldier for going quiet. You can only teach them not to. So a few days after the inspection, I did something that had nothing to do with punishment. I brought the crew together, the actual 9, in a small room, and I did not lecture them, and I did not forgive them, because neither of those was the point. I asked them a question. When the hand came off the track, I said, "Who wanted to say stop?" The room was quiet for a long moment, then slowly a hand went up, then another, then most of them. The first hand up, before any of the others, before he could see whether it was safe, was Specialist Bellows. I looked at all those raised hands, those good soldiers who had wanted to say stop and had not, and I did not shame them for it. That instinct you just raised your hand about, I told them. That is the job, not the console, not the equipment. That, the willingness to say stop when the track needs someone to say stop, no matter who is standing behind your chair. Nobody taught you it was safe to do that. That is my fault to fix, not yours to apologize for. But now you know I know you wanted to. So the next time I expect the hand to come up here. I touched the console, not just in this room afterward. One of the older soldiers on the crew, a staff sergeant who had been on that floor longer than most, cleared his throat and said what several of them were clearly thinking. "Ma'am, with respect, it is easy to say now. In the moment, you see the wrong thing happening, and you also see who is making it happen, and you do the math on what saying stop is going to cost you. Every one of us has done that math." "I know you have," I told him, and I meant it. I have done it too. I did it as a specialist, and I did it as a captain, and I have done it as a colonel. Anyone who tells you the math is easy is lying to you. The math is real. What I am changing is the answer. I am changing what it costs you to say stop, so that the next time you run the numbers come out the other way. That is not a speech. That is a certification standard, and it will have my signature on it, and if anyone ever makes you pay for keeping your hand on a track, you will bring that person to me. The staff sergeant looked at me for a long moment, taking my measure the way soldiers take the measure of a new commander. And then he nodded once, slowly, and I understood that I had told him the one thing he needed to hear, which was that I knew the cost was real, and I was not going to pretend it away. You cannot lead people by telling them their fear is imaginary. You can only lead them by changing the thing they are afraid of. I watched the crew relax by a small degree, and I knew the room had shifted, not all the way, not in one meeting, but enough. They had wanted to say stop. Now they knew their commander wanted them to. The rest would come with time and with proof. That night I called Delbert Cruz. He was 71 by then, long retired, and I called him the way I have called him at every hinge point of my career, because there are some things you can only say to the person who taught you the first thing. I told him the whole story, the chair, the microphone, the 6 words, the empty room. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You cleared a whole room by being right. You did not pull rank until the room was already moving. You know why they moved?" "Because it was the right microphone," I said. "Because it was right," he said. "That is the only rank that ever mattered, and you had it at 19, sitting in that chair shaking, before anybody pinned a thing on you. All they did over the years was catch up the paperwork to what you already were." I did not say anything for a moment, because I did not entirely trust my voice. The girl I told to be right, Cruz said. Just decertified a crew for going quiet. Do you understand what you did? You wrote me into policy. You took the one sentence I gave you in the dark, and you are about to make it a standard on every floor in the region. That is the whole job, Sloan. That is all any of us were ever trying to do. Pass the sentence on. I looked out the window at the dark, and I understood, maybe for the first time fully, that the finding I had written was not really about Colonel Dunmore, and it was not really about the 9. It was about a 19-year-old shaking at a console, and a sergeant crouched beside her chair, and a sentence about being right, and 30 years of trying to be worthy of it. The whole thing had come full circle in a cold, gray room, and I had not even seen it happening. Rebuilding the floor when I got to it. I did on new terms, and I want to be honest that the trust I set out to rebuild was not between the crews and Colonel Dunmore, and it was not a reconciliation. There was no scene where he apologized and I forgave him, and we shook hands and the music swelled. That is not how it went, and I would not have wanted it to. The trust I rebuilt was the crew's trust in their own judgment, which was the thing that had actually been broken. I wrote the new certification standard myself, and I wrote it plainly so that no slogan could hide inside it. Any operator of any rank may call a halt on a live track without asking permission first. A crew would no longer be graded on how smoothly it deferred, on how quiet and orderly and impressive it looked for the visitors. A crew would be graded on one thing above all others. Did the correct hand stay on the correct track under pressure, no matter who was standing behind the chair? Be right, in other words, written into a certification standard, in language a colonel could not talk his way around. I brought Bello in to help me stress test it, not for a medal and not for a photograph, but because he was the person in the whole battalion who had actually lived the thing the standard was meant to prevent, and I have never trusted a policy I did not run past the person who paid for its absence. He was nervous coming into the room, a specialist summoned to help a general write a standard, and I watched him try to figure out whether he was in trouble. You are not in trouble, specialist, I said. I need you to break this for me. I need you to tell me every way a floor could still go quiet with this rule in place. He read it carefully, and then he said something that told me I had picked the right person. Ma'am, it is a good rule, but I almost did not say anything that day. Even when I could see it was wrong, he outranked everybody in the room. He looked up. A rule on a page does not fix that feeling. That sentence you just said, I told him. He outranked everybody, so I almost did not say anything. That is exactly the sentence I am trying to delete from this building. I cannot delete it with a rule alone. You are right, but I can make it so that when you do say stop, the standard is on your side and not on his. That is the most any rule can do. The rest is what I show the floor by what I reward. We talked for an hour, the general and the specialist, breaking a standard together, and it was, I realized, the same conversation Cruz had crouched down to have with me 30 years earlier, just from the other chair. After Bello left, I sat down with the exercise controllers, the people who actually score the crews, and I made them do the harder work, which was to figure out how to grade the new standard without turning it into a slogan. It is one thing to write on a page that a crew is graded on whether the correct hand stayed on the correct track under pressure. It is another thing entirely to build an evaluation that actually measures it, that can tell the difference between a crew that stayed right under pressure and a crew that simply never got pressured. So we designed the pressure in. We built scenarios where a scripted senior voice would lean on the crew to drop a track, to hurry, to defer, and we made the passing condition be that at least one operator kept the hand on and said stop. Not politely, not after the exercise in a side room, on the floor, out loud, in the moment. If the whole crew went quiet when the scripted voice pushed, the crew failed, no matter how clean everything else looked. The controllers pushed back at first, the way good controllers should. One of them, a chief warrant officer who had been grading crews for 15 years, said, "Ma'am, you understand you are going to fail crews that would have passed under the old standard. Good crews, crews that do everything right except this." "Except this," I repeated. "You just said it yourself. Except the one thing. I would rather fail a crew today in an exercise on the only thing that will actually get people killed than pass them today and find out on the night it is real. Fail them, then teach them, then pass them when they have earned it on the thing that matters." He thought about that, and then he wrote it down, and I knew the standard would hold because the person grading it understood why it existed. I did not chase an apology from Dunmore, and none ever came. I want to be plain about that because I think the expectation that these stories end with the antagonist's remorse does real harm. He never said he was sorry. I never asked him to. The floor did not need his apology. The floor needed a rule that did not depend on his mood, and a commander who would reward the raised hand instead of the smooth deference, and those were things I could actually provide. His feelings were not part of the repair. They were, by then, simply not my concern. Reyes noticed the change on the floors before I did. She has a good eye for the small things. A week into the new standard, she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had heard a young controller on a routine track say, out loud, without dropping her voice, "Hold, let me confirm," and that no one on the floor had flinched, and that the supervisor had simply waited. Such a small thing. A junior soldier saying hold, and a room letting her. But that was the entire repair, right there, in 4 words and a pause. That was everything the finding had been for. The evening before the change of command, I walked the operations hall alone. The floor was dark and nearly empty, only the midshift crew at their positions, and the screens throwing their cold light the way they had thrown it the morning Dunmore pulled my chair, the way they had thrown it on my first night at 19. I stood at the back in the shadow between the equipment racks in the same spot, and I let myself feel the size of what I was about to sign for. In the morning, I would answer for every screen in the region, every floor, every crew, every slow, low track hugging the edge of every scope. Tonight, I just wanted to sit at one. So I did. I found an open console on the midshift, and I asked the young sergeant beside it if I could sit in for a few minutes, and she looked at my collar this time and went a little pale and said, "Yes, ma'am, of course." I sat down, and I put my hands on the controls, and I worked a routine track for a while, purely to feel it, to remember. The picture resolved under my hands the way it always has, and something in my chest that had been tight since the morning of the inspection loosened by a degree. The seat was still sacred. Rank had not taken that from me. If anything, 30 years had only made the chair feel more like home, not less. The young sergeant stood a respectful distance behind me while I worked, and after a few minutes she found the courage to ask the question I could see she had been holding. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything," I said, without turning from the scope. "Is it true? What happened with Colonel Dunmore? That he pulled you out of a chair and told you to let the adults handle it, and you were the incoming commander the whole time?" She said it carefully, testing whether the story that was surely racing through the whole battalion by now was one she was allowed to have heard. "It is true," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Everybody's talking about the part where you cleared the room, but I keep thinking about the specialist, the one who tried to say something. Bello." She hesitated. "I do not think I would have said anything, ma'am. If I am being honest, I do not think I would have had the nerve." I turned around then and looked at her, this young sergeant being honest with a general in the dark, which is its own small kind of courage. "You know what?" I told her. "The fact that you just said that out loud, to me, tonight, tells me you have more nerve than you think. The soldiers I worry about are the ones who are sure they would have spoken up. They are usually the ones who go quietest. The ones who admit they are afraid are the ones who eventually learn to do it anyway. Bello was afraid too. He told me so himself. He almost did not say anything. The difference is not the fear. The difference is what you do with your hand while you are afraid. Keep your hand on the track. The words will catch up." She nodded slowly, and I could see her filing it away the way I had filed away Cruz's sentence at 19, and I thought, that is how it passes down. Not in ceremonies, in cold rooms, one honest sentence at a time. Lieutenant General Petrie called me while I sat there, to talk about the morning and about what kind of commander I intended to be. "You know," he said, "most commanders would have let that one slide. 9 days out from taking the organization, a battalion commander embarrasses himself in front of you, and the smooth play is to accept his apology, keep the peace, and start clean. Most generals would have done exactly that." "Most generals were never pulled out of the chair," I said. "I was. I remember what it felt like to be the specialist that nobody in the room would listen to. I am not going to forget it now just because I finally outrank everybody. That was the whole point of getting here." He was quiet, and then he said, "That is the right answer." And we left it there. I read the crew's recertification results before I logged off the console that night. They had run it again under the new standard, and they had passed on the exact thing they had failed. A hand staying on a hard track while someone tried to pull it off. I let myself feel the first real relief since the morning I had been thrown out of the room, but I did not let myself call it finished because it was not finished. Something was still owed. Not to Dunmore, who was a closed file. Something was owed to Specialist Bellow, and to the 19-year-old he had reminded me of, the one who had done the work in the quiet and watched a colonel take the credit. I left the console exactly as I had found it, the screens humming, the track resolved, the young sergeant's coffee still steaming beside her keyboard. On my way out, I turned off the light over the empty position I had borrowed, the small automatic courtesy of a person who has spent her life in these rooms. Not a general leaving, an operator locking up. The change of command was the next morning, and I will not spend long on the ceremony itself, because the ceremony was the least important thing that happened that day. I took the organization. The guidon passed, the words were said, the salutes were rendered. Colonel Dunmore was not there, and his absence was the quietest part of the morning, and no one remarked on it, and that was exactly right. He was not the story. He had never really been the story. My first act as the commander was not about him at all. In front of the formation, I signed the new certification standard into effect across every operations floor in the command. Any operator, any rank, may call a halt on a live track. A crew is graded on whether the correct hand stayed on the correct track under pressure. It took 30 seconds to sign, and it was the most important thing I did all year. And then I did the thing that was owed. I called Specialist Cass Bellow out in front of the formation. Not for heroics. He had not stormed a beach or pulled anyone from a fire. I called him out for something smaller and, I have come to believe, rarer. 9 days ago, I said, so the whole formation could hear it. This soldier was the only person on a live operations floor willing to keep his hand on a hard track and try to say stop to a colonel. He was right, and he was quiet about it, and nobody in that room would listen. That is the standard now. Not the rank behind the chair, the hand on the track and the willingness to say, stop. I looked at him, standing rigid and stunned in the front rank. His name is Bellow. Learn it. That was the payoff, not a colonel's face going pale, though it had. Not an empty room, though I had cleared one. The payoff was a specialist's name said out loud in front of a formation, and a standard signed so that the next quiet, competent soldier at the quiet, competent console would never again have to watch someone louder take the credit and pull the hand off the track. I watched the formation while I said his name, and I watched something move through it that I have only seen a few times in 30 years. It was recognition, the good kind, the kind that spreads. Soldiers who had spent that whole battalion learning that the reward went to the loudest and the smoothest were watching their new commander, on her first morning, hand the recognition to the quietest person in the building. For the least glamorous thing imaginable, for keeping his hand on a track and trying to say stop. I could see them recalibrating in real time, doing a new kind of math, the math of a floor where being right in the quiet might actually be seen. That was worth more than any words I could have said about culture or standards. They did not need me to tell them the culture had changed. They watched it change once in the length of time it took to say one specialist's name and tell them to learn it. Bellow himself stood rigid in the front rank, and I could see he did not know what to do with it, this young man who had spent his short career being unremarked. Suddenly remarked upon by the commander in front of everyone. He would learn to carry it, they always do. And every time in the years ahead that he kept his hand on a hard track, he would remember that once it was seen, and that would make it a little easier the next time. And that is how you build a floor that will not go silent on the night it matters. One scene, hand at a time. People kept asking me, afterward, to describe the look on the colonel's face when I told him who I was. They wanted that moment. They wanted the satisfaction of it. And I could not give it to them, because the honest truth is that I had already stopped thinking about him. By the time I signed the standard, Colonel Dunmore had become a name in a closed file, and my mind was entirely on a young specialist who had kept his hand on a hard track when the whole room went quiet. That is where my attention went, and that is where it stayed. The antagonist of the story I was living was not a person. It was a silence, and I had spent 9 days making sure that silence would never sit down at one of my consoles again. I still sit at the consoles. I am the commander now. I answer for every screen in the region, and I still, when I can, sit down at the edge of a cold room full of screens and work a track, because it keeps me honest and because it is the only place the truth ever sits still. And when I sit down now, unannounced in a plain uniform, the room does not go silent. It does not freeze and wait to see what the senior person wants. It keeps working, and if a young operator sees something wrong on the scope, the young operator says, "Hold, let me confirm," and no one flinches. So here is what I want to leave you with. Whoever you are, wherever you are watching from, whether you have ever seen a room like the one I have described or never will, you do not have to raise your voice to prove you belong in the chair. You do not have to be the loudest rank in the room or any rank at all. You just have to be right, and you have to be willing to say stop when the moment needs someone to say it, no matter who is standing behind you. That is a quiet kind of power, and it is the only kind that lasts, because it is the one kind no one can ever pull out from under you. I spent 30 years earning my seat at that console. A colonel tried to take it from me in 10 seconds because he did not know my name. And in the end, the lesson was never about him, and it was never even really about me. It was about the sentence a sergeant crouched down and gave a frightened 19-year-old in the dark, 30 years ago, the only sentence that has ever mattered in that cold room full of screens. Be right, then say stop. And do not ever let anyone of any rank teach you that going quiet is the same thing as knowing your place. The end. Thanks for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. I still think about that young specialist who kept his hand on the track when the whole room went quiet, and about the sergeant who told me the truth in the dark. So let me ask you, if you had been on that floor, do you think you would have said stop? Have you ever watched real competence go unnoticed because someone louder took the credit? And have you ever had to earn back the respect of a room that underestimated you the moment you walked in? I would love to hear your story in the comments. If this one meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay a while.